Hello, everyone. The fourth session for today, Bar S and BVA track is by Eric Chang. He's going to talk about empowering Fusion Dev teams with custom connectors. Over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Lynn. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yep, I can see
Cool.
it.
So hello, everyone. And firstly, a big thank you to Rami, Hamish, and everyone behind the scenes for organizing, moderating, and sharing at such a wonderful conference today. My name is Eric Chang, and I am very excited to be able to share my session with you today on empowering Fusion dev teams with custom connectors. The goal for today is really to provide you with an introduction to custom connectors and really why you should be using them. We'll explore what custom connectors are, what challenges they aim to address, and also, skip a bit. Technical difficulties. Okay, there we go. What challenges they aim to address and how they can bridge the gap between your pro devs and the makers to accelerate and enable them to do more on the Power Platform. We'll also look at how you can create custom connectors and how to use these connectors once they have been created across the Power Platform. And obviously along the way, we'll go through a few demos so you can see how all of this fits together in real life. So before we begin, just a quick introduction. My name is Eric Chang, and I'm a digital solutions architect at Komatsu Australia. I've been working with Microsoft low-code and pro-code technologies for over a decade across Office 365, business applications, and Azure. I'm also a certified Azure architect, DevOps engineer, Power Platform maker, and trainer. If you do have any questions regarding today's session, we'll have a Q&A section at the end, but also feel free to contact me via email, social media, or you can also find me on the Microsoft Power Automate community forums, where I enjoy helping everyone learn more about the Power Platform. So before we dive into custom connectors and see what they're all about, I think it's important to understand what a connector is and why they're so important. If you have been using the Power Platform before, whether as a maker for an app, a flow, or a virtual agent, chances are you've come across or used a connector before to connect what you've been building to another system or application. And really, if we peek beneath the hood of the Power Platform, everything is done via API calls, or in other words, a programmatic way. Whether you're trying to create a record in Dataverse or a SQL table, or trying to query from SharePoint or Excel, everything is done via these API calls. Now, for myself, from a development background, understanding, building, and using these APIs have been something that I have learned and done over a very long time. However, for many makers who may have never been exposed to APIs before, there can be a bit of a learning curve, and it can even be quite daunting. And this is really where the Power Platform simplifies the process of building solutions through the availability of hundreds of pre-built connectors that comes available out of the box. And these pre-built connectors really simplifies the process of connecting to a range of different SaaS applications, to Office 365, and even to various cloud services and databases. You can even connect to your on-premise resources, such as your file shares or your applications behind a firewall via an on-premise data gateway. Are really just wrappers around an API and really act as a visual building block for your makers that they can consume and use as part of their apps, flows, or virtual agents. They abstract away much of the complexity and guesswork of using and consuming APIs, like deciding which endpoint or operation to use, what authentication to use, and also what the expected inputs and outputs will be. And this is really the main driving force behind the whole popularity of the Power Platform. Having these hundreds of pre-built connectors that comes readily available, that allows your makers to just focus on solving business problems without having to be bogged down with the technicalities. So now that we understand what a connector is, let's look at why you would ever need to use a custom connector. Well, whilst Microsoft does provide connectors to interact with many applications and systems, There are going to be times when there just isn't a connector available for something that you need. If you think about all the applications in the world and all the API endpoints in the world, whether public or private, it simply isn't going to be possible to have a pre-built connector for each one. For example, you may have a bespoke application. It could be a legacy application, on-premise, or even a SaaS application. An application which is super critical to your organization and that you need to connect with the Power Platform. And if it's bespoke, chances are there's not going to be a pre-built connector available. And again, if there is an API layer, it's probably going to be custom developed. So in these cases, you'll probably need to have custom connectors available to enable your makers to interact and connect to these systems and applications. Similarly, you may want to connect to some public APIs to retrieve and download some information. It could be public APIs to the government department to download information about the traffic, the train schedule, or it could even be some APIs with a vendor that you do business with to access a product or price list to load into your own system. Again, chances are there's not going to be any pre-built connectors available. And lastly, you may want to connect to an application where there may already be a connector available, but because there's some limitations of that connector, or it simply may not have the actions that you need to do what you want, and that may prevent you from using it. For example, whilst there is a Jira connector available, if you have Jira server behind a firewall, for example, you won't be able to use it. Similarly, if you've got MySQL or Oracle DB or a hosted version of these databases, again, the limitations means that you won't be able to connect to these systems to do what you need. So I've just outlined some situations where your makers would pretty much just stop in their tracks and your productivity and innovation will quickly grind to a halt. And really, this is where custom connectors come into play. And just as connectors are wrappers around APIs, custom connectors are simply custom wrappers that you create around APIs, whether these APIs are custom or not. So in reality, we can build custom connectors for any type of RESTful API as long as you have access to connect to them. These could be APIs on-premise. These could be APIs in the cloud, hosted in Azure as a platform as a service. And these could even be serverless endpoints like Azure Functions and Logic Apps. It doesn't really matter what language they're written in, where they're hosted, as long as they're going to be available and they're RESTful. So at this point, you may be asking, but why can't makers just use the HTTP connector that's already available in the Power Platform? I mean, it's there for a reason, right? And the answer is yes, makers can do that and use that. And there are many different ways of getting around many different problems. But in my opinion, custom connectors provide a number of additional key benefits that, over some of these other options. So let's look at what these benefits are. Firstly, simplicity. I touched on the burden and challenges of reading and understanding API documentation and then translating that into a request using the HTTP connector. By using custom connectors, we can specify and configure all of this during the creation stage and really abstract away all the technical decisions, like again, which actions should be made available, what are the headers, authentication, inputs, outputs, and also the data types and whether they should be mandatory or not. So again, we're taking away all the burden or the decision making away from the makers who really just want to focus on solving business problems. Reusability. By using custom connectors, we simply build once and reuse across the entire Power Platform. If we were to leverage the HTTP connector, we would have to manually specify the endpoint of the API, the headers, the authentication, the payload, every time that the connector is used. And this can be cumbersome for the maker to use and also to maintain. If the API changes and we need to add or remove headers or maybe swap out an API key, we would have to find and replicate the change with every step that the connector is used for that endpoint. And by using custom connectors, we can simplify this and simply modify the connector once, and again, abstract away all the technicalities and maintenance away from as much of that from makers as possible. Thirdly, Security. By using custom connectors, we can also enforce data loss prevention policies at a much more granular level. If your makers was using the HTTP connector to make requests, you would historically only have the ability to enable or disable or block the connector for everyone, regardless of where they're connecting to. Now, with that said, there is actually a feature in preview right now which allows you to be a little bit more granular and enable and deny endpoints. But then you still have the additional overhead of maintaining and administering that list. And by creating custom connectors, this security can still happen at a much more granular level, and with that, the administration overhead. Reporting. I talked about the potential for changes to the underlying APIs, and by using custom connectors, we can also report on the usage of each custom connector through the Power Platform Admin Center, or if you're using it, the COE Starter Kit. And this is particularly useful for administrators because we can get visibility into which of our apps, flows, and virtual agents are using these connectors and also where they're connecting to. Again, if we need to upgrade or deprecate an API, we can see what the potential impacts are going to be at a glance and really sort these issues out before they become a bigger problem later downstream. So that's very important. And lastly, limitations and extra features. Again, I talked about some of the limitations of pre-built connectors and how custom connectors can help overcome some of these limitations. Another thing that actually comes into mind is sometimes it's not the connector, but more so limitations with the platform itself. For example, in Power Apps, it had always been a challenging problem for makers to make direct HTTP calls to external API services. What they would traditionally do would maybe to create a Power Automate Cloudflow with a Power Apps trigger, which would then call that API via an HTTP trigger. And again, by using custom connectors, we can save on the development and the maintenance of really an unnecessary Cloudflow and really bypass that double hop by calling the API directly within our Power App. So by now, hopefully, I've managed to convince you of the benefits of custom connectors and really why you should be using them over some of the alternative methods. So next, let's jump into our demos. But before we dive into creating custom connectors, I want to show you what we'll actually be building out as part of our demo so you can see what we'll be working towards. So I'm going to minimize my PowerPoint slide and I'm going to jump over to Power Apps. So I've got an environment here with a pre-built app just to show you what that looks like. And if we open up this app, we're going to have a Canvas app. It's a Pokemon checker app. And it's a Canvas app that's really quite simple. There's really 3 screens, a home screen, a name screen, and really what this name screen will do is it will allow you to perform a name search on a particular Pokemon. So you can type Pikachu, for example, and it'll provide you with the image of Pikachu and also Pikachu's abilities and moves. And if you go and type in another Pokemon, it'll do the same thing. So this screen will connect to a custom connector that we'll be building out. And this custom connector will be calling the Pokemon API. And the Pokemon API is a freely available RESTful API that allows you to return information about different things within the Pokemon universe. Pokemon's obviously being one of them. And I'll talk more to this API a little bit later. But if we go back to my app, I have a third screen here, which is an image search. And really, this image search allows me to perform a identifier for a Pokemon. So if I pass in the URL of an image, for example, and put that in here, it's going to identify what Pokemon it is based on that image. So it's going to identify, again, it's Pikachu, and again, the details of that particular Pokemon. And if I go and pass in another Pokemon, for example, hit search, it's going to identify that based on the image. So what this screen will do is it will call another custom connector that we'll be building out. And this custom connector will do a reverse image search, find the name of that Pokemon based on the image, and then again, pass it to the first connector to get the details of that Pokemon. So obviously it's a very cheap way of doing a Pokemon classifier, But again, the purpose of what we're building here isn't really to build out an accurate machine learning classifier model, but more so just to build out different connectors and see how we can use these within the Power Platform. So with that said, I'm going to close up this app and I'm going to go to another environment, which is just my default environment. And this environment won't have those connectors available, and we'll build these out from scratch. So to build out a custom connector, we're going to build out the Pokemon API one first. We're going to go to Dataverse, and then we're going to go down to custom connectors. Now you can actually do this from Power Automate as well. So if you're in the Power Automate maker, you can actually go to Data and Custom Connectors, and it will be the same thing. Both will create the same connector, will make it available across the Power Platform at the environment level. Okay, so I'm just going to close that. So once you click into Custom Connectors, you'll be taken to an overview screen. You will see any other connectors that you have access to edit. And from here, you can actually go and create connections. You can download the Open API file, or also used to be known as the actually then import into another environment so that you can migrate connectors across. You can also edit the connector, and you can also do a host of other things, like, for example, inviting other users to co-author your connectors as well. So to create a custom connector, we simply go to the top right-hand side corner here and click on New Custom Connector. And as you can see, we get presented with a number of different options. So you can create a custom connector from scratch, which will be what we'll be doing for the first connector. And what this will do is it will take you through a wizard, and you'll have the whole end-to-end experience to configure and create your connector. You can create a custom connector from Azure Services. This will be the second connector that we'll be creating. So one of the great things about the Power Platform is the tight integration with Azure. So if you've got any APIs that resides in Azure Services, it could be deployed as an app service. It could be, again, a serverless endpoint, such as an Azure function or a logic app, or it could even be an on-premise API that you hide or manage behind an API management gateway. Again, it provides you with a very streamlined approach of creating these connectors, and we'll see a little bit more a little bit later. If you have the Open API file, so as I was showing you earlier, maybe you've downloaded it from somewhere, you can actually import that, or you can specify it from a URL. If you use Postman, which I use a lot as a testing tool, you can also import a connection. And also, if you've got your API from in GitHub, you can also import that from GitHub as well. So from here, we're going to go and create our connector from scratch. And what we'll need to provide first is the name of our connector. So really, you can specify any name that you want. However, it should probably make a little bit of sense for your makers so they can quickly identify what this connector is for. So we're going to give the name Pokemon, obviously, and click on Continue. And when you click on Continue, you'll be taken to a wizard with a number of different steps. And we'll walk through each of these steps a little bit later. But the first step that we'll need to action is the general information step. And this is where you provide really the general information about this connector, including, the image or the logo, a description, and also what is the host name of that API. So here I'm going to just quickly provide a image of that connector just to make it a little bit easier to identify. And we're going to go and specify background color just to make it a little bit nicer. And I'm going to give it a name, a description. So I'm just going to go connector to Pokemon API to get information. Could be anything you want. If your API is behind a firewall in a private network, in a private virtual network in Azure, you can also specify to connect via an on-premise data gateway. So we're not going to do that here, but an on-premise data gateway is really just an agent that you install on a device in your network. It's usually a server, and really it becomes a relay between Power Platform in the cloud or Azure to your private endpoint, and will relay the traffic back and forth. That's really what an on-premise data gateway is. You can specify whether it's going to be a secure connection, 443 or 80, and also the host name. So if I go back to my Pokemon API, copy out the URL, and I'm just going to paste that in here and get rid of the HTTP. And for the base URL, we're going to leave it as the default. That's pretty much it. We're going to go to the next stage of our wizard, which is security. Security is very important because chances are you'll need to authenticate to your API. Now, I mentioned before, our Pokemon API is freely available, so I didn't need to subscribe. There's no API keys. So for myself, I'm going to select no authentication. However, for your APIs, most likely you'll need to authenticate into that API to be able to call it. So from here, you can specify basic authentication, which is username and password. You might get an API key, or you might want to authenticate using OAuth 2.0, for example, Azure Active Directory. So depending on what you pick here, when the user creates that connection, they'll be prompted for username and password, they'll be prompted for an API key, or they'll be prompted to log in, similar to much of the Power Platform connectors. So here, I'm going to click on no authentication, and I'm going to leave it at that. Moving on is the definition step. So this is really where the bulk of your connector is going to be configured. As you'll see a little bit later, it's going to get very busy. And we'll start at the top, which are actions. So actions are basically what your makers can do when they go and add your connector into their app, flow, or virtual agent. And really, if we think about the SharePoint connector, for example, there's actions for creating items, deleting items, updating items, creating files, etc. And those are really just the actions. So here we need to create actions that maps to different operations or different things that your API can do. So if we go back into our API documentation here and just click on Docs. So I talked about the Pokemon endpoint, which will provide you with sort of the high level overview of the Pokemon. But there's a lot of other things and a lot of other information that you can get from this API. For example, you can get the evolution. Find out what your Pokemon can evolve to. You can get locations, so get locations within the Pokemon universe, a whole bunch of different things. So really, you can create different actions to different operations. So I'm going to just create an operation to the Pokemon action to the Pokemon operation or endpoint. So here, I'm going to click on New Action, and I'm just going to provide this and provide some information. So here, I'm going to say Pokemon details. Ooh, keyboard. Neither. I'm just going to paste the same thing. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call it the same, Pokemon. It doesn't have to be the same. It can be up to you. Okay. Scrolling down a little bit, we have visibility. So if you've used connectors before in Power Automate, visibility affects how your makers will see the parameters and also the dynamic content. If you select important, then all your parameters and your dynamic content will fit within the one screen and they can scroll up and down. If you select advanced, then they'll still be available to your makers, but they'll have to click on the show advanced option and also the see more option. And again, if they select internal, then it'll hide it from the makers so they won't be able to access it from the UI. So for this, I don't really care about the visibility, so I'll just select important. The next step is the request, which is where you specify the JSON request payload that you're going to send into the API. So Power Platform makes it really easy to actually create your request. You simply have to click on import from sample, and you'll just need to provide some details as to whether it's a GET request, POST request, PUT request, the URL of the endpoint, any headers, and also the body. So what we can do here is we can go back to our documentation. We can see that it's a GET command. We're just going to copy out this URL, and we're just going to go back into our wizard, select GET, paste that in as is. And if you've got any custom headers, with your API. You might need to specify content type. You might need to specify a bearer token, for example. You can put all of that in here. So we're going to click on import, and you can see the wizard will automatically pick up that there's a parameter as part of the URL path, which is called ID or name. And again, you can configure all of this. So if I go into here and click on edit, I can change the name of the parameter, give it a description. I can specify default values, whether it's required, again, the visibility, and also the data type. So I'm just going to leave that as the default. Now, I'm just going to come back into import and do the same thing. Some URLs or some APIs may also require you to pass in a query string parameter. So for example, you might need to pass in ID equals to 1 to get a specific item or record. So if we go back and do the same thing and click on import, again, you can see the wizard will automatically pick up a query string parameter. So again, it's quite simple. I don't need the query string parameter, so I'm just going to delete that out of here. And we're going to go to the last section, which is the response. So the response is what's returned from your API to the connector. So to do this, we're going to go back to our documentation, and we're going to go and copy out the sample JSON request payload that's returned back. So you can see there's a lot of information there. I'm going to copy that out, and we're going to just go here and go to add default response. Again, if you've got any headers that's going to be returned from your APIs, you can also specify it here. We're going to click on import, and what it's going to do is it's going to populate all the values in the JSON request body. And if we click onto this, usually it takes a little while because it will map it for you. You can see all the values will be will automatically be mapped for you, and these will be made available to your makers as dynamic content depending on your visibility settings. And again, each of these can be configured. Okay, you can customize, each of these parameter values, the data type, etc. So we're going to keep scrolling down. We've got a validation section here. It will just basically do a quick sanity check. Are there any glaring problems with your connector? You can see here our validation has passed. So if we scroll back up, that's really our action completed. And again, you can add in additional actions. So for example, you might want to create an additional action to locations, so your users can use the same connector to also get locations in your API or from the API. So you can create as many as you want here. The last thing I want to talk about in this screen are policies. So policies allows you to manipulate the request and the response to and from your custom connector. So there are some templates that you can apply here, and really it's quite fixed as to what you can do here. You can, for example, set properties, set query strings, set headers, so that, for example, if I go and set a query string, all the request that comes in or comes into my connector will also append that query string. Again, that's just a policy. And the reason why we can do this is because these connectors will route through an API management gateway that is managed by Microsoft, and there's all these policies that are available. However, with that said, there are limitations because you have to specify one of those templates. There is this new feature available though called code. So it is a preview feature, and what code allows you to do is be a bit more flexible in how you want to manipulate the request and the response. So code allows you to actually type in C# code. You can, and I'll actually go to the documentation. You can do things like, again, add in headers. You can, do a transfer. So instead of a get, you can redirect it to a post. You can also do validation. And probably one of the most common things that, or most useful things that personally I think would be useful is regular expression. So in Power Automate, that's one of the major limitations. You can't really easily do regular expressions. So again, you can create a custom connector that really just simply does a regular expression. There are some limitations. So for example, your code file has to be under 1 megabyte, and also your code has to be executed within 5 seconds. So, but again, it's a preview feature and it's there to know. So we don't need this, so we'll just leave it as disabled, but you can actually just enable it and specify it at the operation level. So you don't actually have to turn it on for every operation. So that's pretty much it. So we can now go to test, and before we can test, you'll get a prompt saying, hey, you need to create the connector. And basically that just means you need to save it. So we're going to click on create connector. We'll take a few seconds. And once we create the connector, we can actually go and test our connector from within the same user interface. So now that our connector has been saved or created, just like a user using the connector from the Power Platform, we'll need to create a connection. Now, if you selected an authentication type in your wizard, you'll be prompted for username, passwords, API keys, or sign in. Again, mine was no authentication, which is why I can just go and create it from scratch without specifying anything. So the annoying thing here is that it will actually take you to a connection screen. So what you'll need to do is just go back to custom connectors, go back into the edits, go back into test, and you can see we've got our connection there. And what I'll do here is I'll type in the name of the Pokemon. So you can see we've got a 200, which is a success, and we've got the details back from the API. And other one, there we go. So before we go to the app and see how we can add those connectors in, I want to show you the second connector that we're going to create. And the second connector that we're going to create will be to my Logic app. So the Logic app is really, if you've built a Power Automate Cloudflow before, will look very similar. But basically a Logic app is the Azure version of it. And it used to be a serverless sort of API, but now you can actually create it as both. But it is a serverless API that you can create using a visual designer. The API here isn't really important. What I want to show you is that it is an Azure endpoint. And what it will do is we'll have an HTTP request trigger, and it will call an API to do a reverse image search, and it will return me the Pokemon name. And based on this Pokemon name, I will then pass it to the first connector we just created to actually go and get the details of that Pokemon. Now, on the topic of Azure Services, what I've also done is I've put this Logic app behind an API management gateway. So the API management gateway is really a management or security mechanism that sits in front of an API, and we can actually, secure it. We can gain visibility. We can manage it a little bit better. But the reason I did this is I want to show you how we can also create our custom connectors if you have an API management gateway that manages your APIs. So here, I've got the same API that goes to my Logic app with an operation. If I now go back into Power Apps, into my custom connector screen, I'm going to click on New Custom Connector and go to Create from Azure Services. So similar to before, I need to provide a name connector. I need to provide a little bit more details because it is going to integrate or link to Azure. So I need to provide things like my Azure subscription, which is like my account, the Azure service that I'm going to connect to. So if I didn't have that API management gateway, I would select Logic app, and you can see it's automatically picked that up because I have access to it and I'm logged in as myself. If, for example, you've got Azure Functions, which is another type of API, you can also go and select it here from here as well. I don't have any. And again, for our example, we have an API management gateway. I can select the service of my gateway and then also the API that's defined within that gateway. So here, I've provided all the details. I'm going to click on Next. And you can see it takes me to the same wizard. The only key difference is that it will pre-populate some of the settings for me. So things like the description, which probably isn't really descriptive, but mostly the host name. Okay. If I go next to security, it's going to pick up that I need to pass in an API key, which will be passed as the header. And again, I can change this. I can say, okay, I don't want to pass this as the header. I want to pass this as the query string. And I know that with the API Management Gateway, it will support both. So let's go and change this and have a look. In the definition step, you can see a lot of the details is pre-populated. Now you see there's manual invoke here. And the reason it has manual invoke automatically populated is because in my API Management Gateway, I was a bit lazy. I used the wizard, out of the box wizard, to add the logic app, which automatically gives it a manual invoke name, which is all the way somewhere in here. Okay, so again, you can still go in and change it if you need to, just like the visibility settings. So the request is automatically populated for you, but what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go and do it again. And the reason I'm doing this is I'm going to go and specify a JSON body, which is image URL. And you can see if I go into the body, it's going to pick up the image URL for me. And similar to the request, I'm going to go to the response and I'm going to go import from sample and just import that from a sample. So that's pretty much it. You can see here the validations actually picked up that the operation ID should have an uppercase as the first letter. So let's go and change that. And let's go back down and we've now validated. So we'll go through the code step. Again, we can leave it as it is. And the test step, we just need to save our connector. So in this example, I've passed in, I'll pass in the API key as a query string or by default as a header. Now, again, I'll need to provide that key when I create the connection, as you see. If I didn't want the users to actually have to do this, there's a number of different ways, obviously, but one way would be actually to use those policies I talked about earlier. You can actually have the key in the policy or maybe reference a key vault and then abstract away from the end users. But here I need to provide the API key. So I'm just going to put that in here and click on create. And it's going to create a connection and it's going to take me back to the connection screen. I'm going to go back to custom connectors, reverse image search, test that out. So I'm just going to go and make sure I've got an image. And I'm going to paste that image in and test operation. So I get 200 and it's detected that it's a Pikachu. If I go back to my logic app and go to my run history, you can see I'm in Sydney time, so it's probably 12:38. I can see that it's executed successfully and it's got Pikachu. So now I have my two custom connectors ready. Let's go back to my Power App Studio. I'm just going to go and move back to the default environment. I've got an app which doesn't have any connections. So if I go to edit, we'll just need to wait a little bit for the studio to load. And what we'll be doing is we'll be adding those two connectors in. I'll do a quick walkthrough of what it does. So I may actually have the connectors in there, connections in there. So anyways, let's move on. So to add a connection to your custom connector, it's the same way as any connectors. You'll click on data and let's just delete these two. You'll click on add data and what you'll do is you'll just type in the name of your connector and really just click on it and it'll add it in. So from your maker's point of view, it's really the same as what they've been doing all along. And again, if you've got a flow, it's the same. They'll be able to search for that connector using the connector name. So if we go to the tree view, now if you've been sitting in the first session, you're probably going to be horrified at this app. But again, the purpose of this is not best practices. It's pulling an app together as quickly as possible. So if we go to search, for example, you can see here, we're going to click on select. And what we're going to do is, probably shouldn't have deleted those two. Because it's lost the references. Bit of a pain. Okay, so anyways, what we'll do is we'll leave it as it is, but I'll just quickly run through what it's supposed to intending to do. So when we get to the photo screen, when you click on the image, what it should do is it will set a global variable. It will call my my first connector, pass in the image or the data from my text box. It will return and save that as the Pokemon image object, and then it will also pass that to my second connector and then save that as a Pokemon object global variable. So here I've got a number of labels, which basically references just the attributes of that particular variable. So there's a Pokemon name, there's, because it is a table, I'm just going to concatenate all the data together to and display it into the label. I think I actually know why. So that's why we always have a backup environment. So I'll go into the backup environment. Again, it's the same connectors, but obviously it works. So you'll be able to see that. But this was the first thing that we saw earlier. So if we go to the search screen, again, it's the same. And select, it's the same. We basically call the Pokemon object, pass in the text box, and again, it will automatically pick up the attributes of that global variable. And for the photo, it's really just the same thing, as I mentioned before. We go and pass in the image URL, and then we pass that to our second connector. Okay. So really, that brings me to the end of my session on creating custom connectors. And I hope you found it interesting and informative. And again, happy to answer any questions they may have. Actually, if there's no questions, I just want to quickly show you one last thing. So we looked at actually creating custom connectors from Power Apps and Power, and pretty much the same thing from within Flow. But one of the things you could do, again, if you have an API management gateway, is actually create the connector from the gateway itself. So within your Azure gateway, you'll see there's actually a Power Platform icon on the left-hand navigation. And you can see here, you've actually got an option to create a custom connector. And really, you can specify what API within that within your APIs you want to create the connector for, what environment, and also what name. So I'll just call this 2, and we'll go create. Okay, so let's do it in my other environment. But my default environment doesn't have a Dataverse environment. So it will go and provision and really create a custom connector in my environment. So again, it's really the same thing, but again, it just shows you the tight linkage and integration between the Power Platform and Azure, and hopefully we'll see a lot more of this integration over time. So that's been created. So if I go back into my backup environment and go to custom connectors, you can see I've got my number 2, and I can really just go in here and again, just probably make some edits and modify it to make to suit my needs. Cool. Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.